Alan Grant crouched down, his nose inches from the ground. The temperature was over 100 degrees. His knees ached despite the rugged layer pads he wore. His lungs burned from the harsh alkali dust, sweat dripping from his forehead onto the ground. But Grant was oblivious to the discomfort. His entire attention was focused on the 6-inch square of earth in front of him. Working patiently with a dental pick and an artist's camel brush, he exposed a tiny L-shaped fragment of a jawline. It was only an inch long and no thicker than his little finger. The teeth were rows of small points and had the characteristic medium angle. Bits of bone flagged away as he dug. Grant paused for a moment to paint the bone with a rubber cement before continuing to expose it. There was no question that this was a jawbone from an infant carnivorous dinosaur. Its owner had died 79 million years ago, at the age of about 2 months. With any luck, Grant might find the rest of the skeleton as well. If so, it would be the first complete skeleton of a baby carnivore. "Hey, Alan!" Alan Grant looked up, blinking in the sunlight. He pulled down his glasses and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He was crouched on an eroded hillside in the Badlands outside Snakewater, Montana. Beneath the gray-blue bowl of sky, blunted hills, exposed outcropping of crumbling limestone, stretches for miles in every direction. Nothing but barren rock, hot sun, and winded wind. Visitors found the Badlands depressingly bleak, but when Grant looked at this landscape, he saw nothing else entirely. This barren land was what reminded of another, very different world, which had vanished 80 million years ago. In his mind's eye, Grant saw himself back in the warm, swampy bayou that formed the shallow lines of the great inland sea. This inland sea was 1,000 miles wide, extended all the way from the newly upthrust Rocky Mountains to the sharp, craggy peaks of the Appalachians. All of the American West was underwater. At that time, there were thin clouds in the sky overhead, darkened by the smoke of nearby volcanoes. The atmosphere was denser, richer than carbon dioxide. Plants grew rapidly along the shoreline. There were no fish in these waters, but there were clams and snails. Pterosaurs swam down to scoop algae from the surface. A few carnivorous dinosaurs prowled the swampy shore of the lake, moving among the palm trees. Offshore was a small island, about 2 acres in size, ranging with dense vegetation. This island formed a protective sanctuary where herds of herbivorous duck-billed dinosaurs laid their eggs in a communal nest and raised their squealing young. Over the millions of years that followed, the pale green alkaline lake grew shallowly and finally vanished. The exposed land bungled and cracked under the heat, and the offshore island with its dinosaur eggs became the erupted hillside in the mountain Montana which Alan Grant was now excavating. "Hey, Alan!" He stood, a barren-chested bearded man of 40. He heard the chugging of the portable generators and the distant clatter of jackhammers cutting into the dense rock on the next hill. He saw the kids working around the jackhammer, moving away the big pieces of rocks after checking them for fossils. At the foot of the hill, he saw the 6th tipping of his camp, the flapping mess tent, and the trailer that served as their field laboratory, and he saw Ellie waving to him from the shadow of the field laboratory. "Visitor!" Grant saw a cloud of dust and a blue Ford sedan bouncing over the rutted road towards them. He glanced at his watch. Right on time. On the other hill, kids looked up with interest. They didn't get any visitors in Snakewater, and there will be a lot of speculations about what a lawyer from the Environmental Protection Agency would want to see Alan Grant about. But Grant knew that paleontology, the study of extinction life, had in recent years taken on an unexpected relevance to the modern world. The modern world was changing fast, and urgent questions about the weather, deforestation, global warming, or the ozone layers often seemed answerable, at least in part, with information from the past, information that paleontologists could provide. He had been called as an expert witness twice in the past few years. Grant started down the hill to meet the car.
Bob Morris, EPA. I'm with the San Francisco office.
Alan Grant, you look hot. Want a beer?
Jesus, yeah.
Maurice was in his late 20s, wearing a tie and pants from a business suit. He carried a briefcase, his wind-type shoes crunching on the rocks as they walked towards the trailer.
When I first came over the hill, I thought this was an Indian reservation.
No, Grant said. Just the best way to live out here.
Grant explained that in 1978, the first year of the excavations, they had come out in North Slope octahedral tents, the most advanced available, but the tents always blew over in the wind. They tried other kinds of tents with the same result. Finally, they started putting up teepees, which were larger inside, more comfortable, and more stable in wind.
These are Blackfeet tippets, built around 4 poles, Grant said. Syrox tippets are built around 3, but this used to be Blackfoot territory, so we thought...
Very fitting. How long you been out here?
About 60 cases, Grant said. We measured time in beer. We started in June with 100 cases. We have gone through about 60 so far. 63 to be exact, Ellie Sattler said, as they reached to the trailer. Grant was amused to see Maurice gaping at her. Ellie was wearing cut-off jeans and a work shirt tie at her midriff. She was 24 and dark and tan. Her blonde hair was pulled back. Ellie keeps us going, Grant said, introducing her. She's very good at what she does.
And what does she do?
Paleobotany, Ellie said. And I also do the standard field preps. The air conditioning in the trailer only brought the temperature down to 85 degrees, but it seems cool after the midday heat. The trailer had a series of long wooded tables with tiny bone specimens neatly laid out, tagged and labeled. Farther along were remic dishes and crooks. There was a strong odor of vinegar. Maurice glanced at the bones.
I thought dinosaurs were big.
They were, Ellie said. But everything you see here comes from babies. Snakewater is important, primarily because of the number of dinosaur nesting sites here. Until we started working, there were hardly any infant dinosaurs known. Only one nest had been found in the Gobi Desert. We have discovered a dozen of different hadrosaur nests, completed with eggs and bones of infants. While Grant went to the refrigerator, she showed Maurice the acidic acid bath, which were used to dissolve away the limestone from a delicate bone.
They look like chicken bones.
Yes, very bird-like.
And what about those?
Rejects, Ellie said. Bones too fragmentary when we took them out of the ground. In the old days, they just discarded them. But nowadays, we send them for the genetic testing.
Genetic testing?
Here you go, Grant said, thrusting a beer into his hand. He gave another one to Ellie. She chugged hers, threw her long neck back. Maurice stared. We're pretty informal here, Grant said. Want to step into my office?
Sure.
Grant led him to the end of the trailer, where there was a torn couch, a saggy chair, and a battered end table. Grant dropped onto the couch, which created and exhaled a cloud of chalky dust. He leaned back, thumping his boot up onto the end table, and gestured Maurice to sit in the chair. Make yourself comfortable.
Grant was a professor of paleontology at the University of Denver, and one of the foremost researchers in his field, but he had never been comfortable with social niceties. He saw himself as an outdoor man, and he knew that all the important work in paleontology was done outdoors with your hands. Grant had little patience for the academics, for the museum curators, for what he called teacup dinosaur hunters, and he took some pains to distance himself in dress and behavior from the teacup dinosaur hunters, even delivering his lectures in jeans and sneakers.
Grant watched as Maurice primly brushed off the seat of the chair before he sat down. Maurice opened his briefcase, rummaged through his papers, and glanced back at Ellie, who was lifting bones with tracers from the acid bath at the other end of the trailer, paying no attention to them.
You're probably wondering why I'm here.
Grant nodded. It's a long way to come, Mr. Maurice.
Well, to get right to the point, the EPA is concerned about the activities of the Hammond Foundation. You received some funding from them.
$30,000 a year, Grant said, nodding. For the last 5 years.
What do you know about the foundation?
The Hammond Foundation is a respected source of academic grants. They fund research all over the world, including several dinosaur researchers. I know they support Bob Carey out in Ontario in Alberta, and John Weller in Alaska. Probably more.
Do you know why the Hammond Foundation supports so much dinosaur research?
Of course, it's because old John Hammond is a dinosaur nut.
You've met Hammond?
Once or twice. He comes here for brief visits. He's quite elderly, you know, and eccentric, the way rich people sometimes are, but always very enthusiastic. Why?
Well, the Hammond Foundation is actually a rather mysterious organization. He pulled out a Xeroxed world map marked with red dots and passed it to Grant. These are the digs the Foundation financed last year. Notice anything odd about them? Montana, Alaska, Canada, Sweden. They're all sites in the north. There's nothing below the 45th parallel. Morris pulled out more maps. It's the same year after year. Dinosaur projects to the south in Utah or Colorado or Mexico never get funded. The Hammond Foundation only supports cold weather digs. We'd like to know why. Grant shuffled through the maps quickly. If it was true that the Foundation only supported cold weather digs, then it was strange behavior because some of the best dinosaur researchers were working in hot climates, and there are other puzzles. For example, what is the relationship of dinosaurs to amber?
Amber?
Yes, it's the hard yellow resin of dried tree sap.
I know what it is, Grant said. But why are you asking?
Because, over the last 5 years, Hammond has purchased enormous quantities of amber in America, Europe, and Asia, including many pieces of museum-quality jewelry. The Foundation has spent $17 million on amber. They now possess the largest privately held stock of this material in the world.
I don't get it, Grant said.
Neither does anybody else. As far as we can tell, it doesn't make any sense at all. Amber is easily synthesized. It has no commercial or defense value. There's no reason to stockpile it. But Hammond has done just that over many years.
Amber, Grant said, shaking his head.
And what about his island in Costa Rica? 10 years ago, the Hammond Foundation leased an island from the government of Costa Rica, supposedly to set up a biological preserve.
I don't know anything about that, Grant said, frowning.
I haven't been able to find out much. The island is 100 miles off the west coast. It's very rugged, and it's in an area of ocean where the combinations of wind and current make it almost perpetually covered in fog. They used to call it Cloud Island, Isla Nublar. Apparently the Costa Ricans were amazed that anybody would want it. Morris searched in his briefcase. The reason I mention it is that, according to the records, you were paid a consultant's fee in connection with this island.
I was?
Morris passed a sheet of paper to Grant. It was the Xerox of a check issued in March 1984 from InGen Incorporated, Farallon Road, Palo Alto, California, made out to Alan Grant in the amount of $12,000. At the lower corner, the check was marked Consultant Services / Costa Rica / Juvenile Hyperspace.
Oh, sure, Grant said. I remember that. It was weird as hell, but I remember it, and it didn't have anything to do with an island.
Alan Grant had found the first clutch of dinosaur eggs in Montana in 1979, and many more in the next 2 years, but he hadn't gotten around to publishing his findings until 1983. His paper, with its report of a herd of 10,000 duck-billed dinosaurs living along the shore of a vast inland sea, building communal nests of eggs in the mud, raising their infant dinosaurs in the herd, made Grant a celebrity overnight. The notion of maternal instincts in giant dinosaurs, and the drawings of cute babies poking their snouts out of the eggs, had appeal around the world. Grant was besieged with requests for interviews, lectures, books. Characteristically, he turned them all down, wanting only to continue his excavations. But it was during those frantic days of the mid-1980s that he was approached by the InGen Corporation with a request for consulting services. "Had you heard of InGen before?" Morris asked.
No.
"How did they contact you?"
Telephone call. It was a man named Gennaro or Gennaro, something like that.
Morris nodded. "Donald Gennaro," he said. "He's the legal counsel for InGen."
Anyway, he wanted to know about eating habits of dinosaurs, and he offered me a fee to draw up a paper for him. Gennaro was particularly interested in young dinosaurs, infants and juveniles, what they ate. I guess he thought I would know about that.
"Did you?"
Not really, no. I told him that. We have found lots of skeletal materials, but we had a very little dietary data. But Gennaro said he knew we haven't published anything, and he wanted whatever we had. And he offered a very large fee, $50,000.
Morris took out a tape recorder and set it on the end table. You mind?
No, go ahead.
So, Gennaro telephoned you in 1984. What happened then?
Well, you see our operation here. $50,000 would support 2 full summers of digging. I told him that I'd do what I could.
So, you agreed to prepare a paper for him?
Yes.
On the dietary habits of juvenile dinosaurs?
Yes.
You met Gennaro?
No, just on the phone.
Did Gennaro say why he wanted this information?
Yes, he was planning a museum for children, and he wanted to feature baby dinosaurs. He said he was hiring a number of academic consultants, and named them. They were paleontologists like me, and a mathematician from Texas, named Ian Malcom, and a couple of ecologists, a system analyst. Good group.
Morris nodded, making notes. So you accepted the consultancy?
Yes, I agreed to send him a summary of our work. What we knew about the habits of duck-billed hadrosaurs we had found.
What kind of information did you send?
Everything. Nesting behavior, territorial ranges, feeding behavior, social behavior, everything.
And how did Gennaro respond?
He kept calling and calling, sometimes in the middle of the night. Would the dinosaurs eat this? Should the exhibit include this? I could never understand why he was so worked up. I mean, I think dinosaurs are important too, but not that important. They've been dead 65 million years. You'd think his calls could wait until morning.
I see. And the $50,000?
Grant shook his head. I got tired of Gennaro and called the whole thing off. We settled up for $12,000. That must have been about the middle of '85.
Morris made a note. And InGen? Any other contact with him?
Not since 1985.
And when did the Hammond Foundation begin to fund your research?
I'd have to look, Grant said. But it was around then. Mid-'80s.
And you know Hammond is just a rich dinosaur enthusiast?
Yes.
Morris made another note.
Look, if the EPA is so concerned about John Hammond and what he's doing, the dinosaur sites in the north, the amber purchase, the island in Costa Rica, why don't you just ask him about it?
At the moment we can't.
Why not?
Because we don't have any evidence of wrongdoing. But personally, I think it's clear John Hammond is evading the law. I was first contacted by the Office of Technology Transfer. The OTT monitors shipments of American technology which might have military significance. They called to say that InGen had 2 areas of possible illegal technology transfer. First, InGen shipped 3 Cray XMPs to Costa Rica. InGen characterized it as transfer within corporate divisions and said they weren't for resale, but OTT couldn't imagine why the hell somebody'd need that power in Costa Rica.
3 Crays, Grant said. Is that a kind of computer?
Very powerful supercomputers. To put it in perspective, 3 Crays represent more computing power than any other privately held company in America. And InGen sent the machines to Costa Rica. You have to wonder why.
I give up. Why?
Nobody knows. And the hoods are even more worrisome. Hoods are automated gene sequencers, machines that work out the genetic code by themselves. They're so new that they haven't been put on the restricted list yet. But any genetic engineering lab is likely to have one if it can afford the $500,000 price tag. He flipped through his notes. Well, it seems InGen shipped 24 hood sequencers to their island in Costa Rica. Again, they said it was a transfer within divisions and not an export. There wasn't much that OTT could do. They're not officially concerned with use, but InGen was obviously setting up one of the most powerful genetic engineering facilities in the world in an obscure Central American country, a country with no regulations. That kind of thing has happened before. There had already been cases of American bioengineering companies moving to another country so they would not be hampered by regulations and rules. The most flagrant, Morris explained, was the Biosyn rabies case. In 1986, Genetic Biosyn Corporation of Cupertino tested a bioengineered rabies vaccine on a farm in Chile. They didn't inform the government of Chile or the farm workers involved. They simply released the vaccine. The vaccine consisted of live rabies virus, genetically modified to be non-virulent, but the virulence hadn't been tested. Biosyn didn't know whether the virus could still cause rabies or not. Even worse, the virus had been modified. Ordinarily, you couldn't contract rabies unless you were bitten by an animal, but Biosyn modified the rabies virus to cross the pulmonary alveoli. You could get an infection just inhaling it. Biosyn staffers brought this live rabies virus down to Chile in a carry-on bag on a commercial airline flight. Morris often wondered what would have happened if the capsule had broken open during the flight. Everybody on the plane might have been infected with rabies. It was outrageous, it was irresponsible, it was criminally negligent, but no action was taken against Biosyn. The Chilean farmers who unwittingly risked their lives were ignorant peasants. The government of Chile had an economic crisis to worry about, and the American authorities had no jurisdiction. So Louis Dodgson, the geneticist responsible for the test, was still working at Biosyn. Biosyn was still as reckless as ever. And other American companies were hurrying to set up facilities in foreign countries that lacked sophistication about genetic research. Countries that perceived genetic engineering to be like any other high-tech development, and thus welcomed to their lands, unaware of the dangers posed. So that's why we began our investigation of InGen about 3 weeks ago.
And what have you actually found? Grant said.
Not much, Morris admitted. When I go back to San Francisco, we'll probably have to close the investigation. And I think I'm about finished here. He started packing up his briefcase. By the way, what does juvenile hyperspace mean?
That's just a fancy label for my report, Grant said. Hyperspace is a term of multi-dimensional space, like three-dimensional, tic-tac-toe. If you were to take all the behaviors of an animal, its eats, and it's moving, and it's sleeping, you could plot the animal within the multi-dimensional space. Some paleontologists refer to the behavior of an animal as occurring in an ecological hyperspace. Juvenile hyperspace, which just refer to the behavior of juvenile dinosaurs. He's in a meeting right now. Can he call you back?
Thanks for your help and the beer.
No problem, Grant said. Grant walked with Maurice down to the trailer to the door at the far end.
Did Hammond ever ask for any physical materials from your site, bones or eggs or anything like that?
No, Grant said.
Dr. Sattler mentioned you do some genetic work here.
Well, not exactly. When we remove fossils that are broken, or for some other reason not suitable for museum preservations, we send the bones out to a lab that grids them up and tries to extract proteins for us. The proteins are then identified, and the report is sent back to us.
Which lab is that?
Medical Biologics Service, in Salt Lake.
How'd you choose them?
Competitive bets.
The lab has nothing to do with InGen?
Not that I know, Grant said. They came to the door of the trailer. Grant opened it and felt the rush hot air from outside. Maurice paused to put on his sunglasses.
One last thing. Suppose InGen wasn't really making a museum exhibit. Is there anything else they could have done with the information in the report you gave them?
Grant laughed. Sure, they would feed a baby hadrosaur.
A baby hadrosaur. That'd be something to see. How big were they?
About so, Grant said, holding his hands 6 inches apart. Squirrely size.
And how long before they become full-grown?
3 years, give or take.
Morris held out his hand. Well, thanks again for your help.
Take it easy driving back, Grant said. He watched for a moment as Maurice walked back towards his car, and then closed the trailer door. What do you think? Ugh, naive. You like the part where John Hammond is the evil arch-villain? Grant laughed. John Hammond's about as sinister as Walt Disney. By the way, who called? Oh, it was a woman named Alice Levin. She works at the Columbia Medical Center. You know her? Grant shook his head. No. Well, it was something about identifying some remains. She wants you to call her back right away. Ellie Sattler brushed a strand of blonde hair back from her face and turned her attention to the acid bath. She had 6 in a row. At Mahler's strength from 5 to 30%, She had to keep an eye on the strong solution because they would eat through the limestone and began to erode the bones, and infant dinosaur bones were so fragile. She marveled that they had been preserved at all after 80 million years. Miss Levin, this is Alan Grant. What's this about a... You have what? A what? Oh, I doubt that very much, Miss Levine. No, I really don't have time, I'm sorry. Well, I had to take a look at it, but I can pretty much guarantee it's a basilisk lizard. But... Yes, you can do that. Alright, send it now. These people. What's it about? Some lizards she's trying to identify, Grant said. She's going to fax me an x-ray. He walked over to the fax and waited as the transmission came through. Incidentally, I've got a new find for you. A good one. Yes? Found it just before the kids show up. On South Hill, Horizon 4. Infant velociraptor, jaw in complete detention, so there's no question about identity. And the site looks undisturbed. We might even get a full skeleton. That's fascinating, Ellie said. How young? Young. 2, maybe 4 months at most. And it's definitely a velociraptor? Definitely. Maybe our luck has finally turned. For the last 2 years at Snakewater, the team have excavated only duck-billed hadrosaurs. They already had evidence for vast herds of these grazing dinosaurs roaming the Cretaceous plain in groups of 10 to 20,000, as buffaloes would later roam. But increasingly, the question that faced them was, where were the predators? They expected predators to be rare, of course. Studies of predator-prey populations in the game parks of Africa and India suggest that, roughly speaking, there was one predatory carnivore that made a herd of 10,000 duckbills would support only 25 tyrannosaurs, so it was unlikely they would find the remains of a large predator. But where were the smaller predators? Snakewater had dozens of nesting sites. In some places, the ground was literally covered with fragments of dinosaur eggshells, and many small dinosaurs ate eggs. Animals like dromaeosaurs, oviraptor, velociraptor, and coelurus, predators 3 to 6 feet tall. Most had been found here in abundance, but they had discovered none so far. Perhaps this velociraptor skeleton did make their luck had changed. And an infant! Ellie knew that one of Grant's dreams was to study infant rearing behavior in carnivorous dinosaurs, as he had already studied the behavior of herbivores. Perhaps this was the first step towards that dream. You must be pretty excited, Ellie said. I said you must be excited. My God, Grant said. You were staring at the facts. You think it's a masochist? Yes, Grant said. Or a Triassicus. The skeleton is so light. But it's not a lizard. No, this is not a lizard. No three-toed lizard has walked on this planet for 200 million years. Could this x-ray be faked? I don't know, Grant said. But it's almost impossible to fake an x-ray. And Procompsognathus is an obscure animal. Even people familiar with dinosaurs have never heard of it. Specimen required on the beach of Cabo Blanco, July 16. Apparently a howler monkey was eating the animal, and this was all that was recovered. Oh, and it says the lizard attacked a little girl. I doubt that, Grant said, but perhaps. Procompsognathus was so small and light we assume it must be a scavenger, only feeding off dead creatures, and you can tell the size. It's about 20 centimeters to the hips, which means full animals would be about a foot tall, about as big as a chicken. Even a child would look pretty fearsome to it. It might bite an infant, but not a child. Ellie frowned at the x-ray image. You think this could really be a legitimate rediscovery? Like the coelacanth? Maybe, Grant said. The coelacanth was a 5-foot-long fish thought to have died out 65 million years ago, until a specimen was pulled from the ocean in 1938. But there were other examples. The Australian mountain pygmy possum was known only from fossils until a live one was found in a garbage can in Melbourne, and a 10,000-year-old fossil fruit bat from New Guinea was described by a zoologist who not only afterward received a living specimen in the mail. But it could be real, she persisted. What about the age? Grant nodded. The age is the problem.
Most rediscovered animals were rather recent additions to the fossil record, 10 or 20,000 years old. Some were a few million years old. In the case of the coelacanth, 65 million years old. But the specimen they were looking at was much, much older than that. Dinosaurs had died out in the Cretaceous period 65 million years ago. They had flourished as the dominant life form on the planet in the Jurassic 190 million years ago, and they had first appeared in the Triassic, roughly 220 million years ago. It was during the early Triassic period that Procompsognathus had lived, a time so distant that our planet didn't even look the same. All the continents were joined together in a single landmass called Pangaea, which extended from the north to the South Pole, a vast continent of ferns and forests with a few large deserts. The Atlantic Ocean was a narrow lake between what would become Africa and Florida. The air was denser, the land was warmer, there were hundreds of active volcanoes, and it was in this environment that Procompsognathus lived.
Well, Ellie said, we know animals have survived. Crocodiles are basically Triassic animals living in the present. Sharks are Triassic, so we know it has happened before. Grant nodded. And the thing is, how else do we explain it? It's either a fake, which I doubt, or else it's a rediscovery. What else could it be? Alice Levin again, Grant said. Let's see if she'll send us the actual specimen. He answered it and looked at Ellie, surprised. Yes, I'll hold for Mr. Hammond. Yes. Of course. Hammond? What does he want? Ellie said. Grant shook his head, and then said into the phone, Yes, Mr. Hammond. Yes, it's good to hear your voice, too. Yes. He looked at Ellie. Oh, you did? Oh, yes? Is that right? Still as eccentric as ever. You've got to hear this. Hell of a noise from some EPA fellow. Seems to have gone off half-cooked. All on his own, running around the country talking to people, steering up things. I don't suppose anybody's come to see you way out there. As a matter of fact, somebody did come to see me. I was afraid of that. Smart-ass kid named Maurice? Yes, his name was Maurice. He's going to see all our consultants. He wants to see Ian Malcom the other day. You know, the mathematician in Texas? That's the first thing I knew of it. We have one hell of a time getting handle on this thing. It's typically the way governments operates. There isn't any complaint. There isn't any charge. Just harassment from some kid who's unsupervised and is running around at the taxpayer's expense. Did he bother you? Disrupt your work? No, he didn't bother me. Well, that's too bad, in a way. Because I had tried and get an injunction to stop him if he had. As it is, I had our lawyers call over at the EPA to find out what the hell their problem is. The head of the office claimed he didn't know there wasn't any investigation. You figured that one out. Damn bureaucrats is all it is. Hell, I think this kid is trying to get down to Costa Rica, poke around, get onto our island. Did you know we have an island down there? No, Grant said, looking at Ellie. I didn't know. Oh yes, we bought it. And started our operation, 4 or 5 years ago now. I forgot exactly. Called Isla Nublar. Big island, 100 miles offshore. Going to be a biological preserve. Wonderful place. Tropical jungle. You know, you're out to see it, Dr. Grant. Sounds interesting, Grant said. But actually... It's almost finished now, you know. I have sent you some materials about it. Did you get my materials? No, but we're pretty far from... Maybe it'll come tomorrow. Look at it. The island's just beautiful. It's got everything. We have been in construction now 30 months. You can imagine. Big park. Opens in September next year. You're really out to go see it. It sounds wonderful, but... As a matter of fact, I'm going to insist you to see it, Dr. Grant. I know you find it right up in your alley. You find it fascinating. I'm in the middle of... Say, I'll tell you what. I'm having some of the people who consult for us go down there this weekend, spending a few days and look it over. At our expense, of course. It'll be terrific if you give us your opinion. I couldn't possibly, Grant said. Oh, just for the weekend. That's all I'm talking about, Dr. Grant. I wouldn't want to interrupt your work. I know how important that work is. Believe me, I know that. Never interrupt your work. But you could hop on down there this weekend and be back on Monday. No, I couldn't, Grant said. I have just found a new skeleton and... Yes, fine. But I think you should come. And we just received some evidence for a very puzzling and unremarkable find, which seems to be a living Procompsognathus. A what? I didn't quite get that. You say a living Procompsognathus? That's right, Grant said. It's a biological specimen, a partial fragment of an animal collected from the Central America. A living animal. You don't say. A living animal. How extraordinary. Yes, Grant said. I think so too. So you see, this isn't a time for me to be leaving. Central America, did you say? Yes. Where in Central America is it from, do you know? A beach called Cabo Blanco. I don't know exactly where. I see. And when did this specimen arrive in your hands? Just today. Today, I see. Today. I see. Yes. Grant looked at Ellie and muttered, "What's going on?" Ellie shook her head. "Sounds upset." Grant muttered, "See if Maurice is still here." She went to the window and looked out, but Maurice's car was gone. She turned back. Ah, Dr. Grant. Have you told anybody about this yet? No. Good. That's good. Well, yes. I'll tell you frankly, Dr. Grant. I'm having a little problem about this island. This EPA thing is coming at just the wrong time. How's that? Grant said. Well, we had our problems and some delays. Let's just say that I'm under a little pressure here, and I'd like you to look at this island for me. Give me your opinion. I'll be paying you the usual weekend consultants rate of $20,000 a day. That'd be $60,000 for 3 days. And if you can spare Dr. Sattler, she'll go at the same rate. We need a botanist. What do you say? Well, Mr. Hammond, as much money would fully finance our expeditions for the next 2 summers. Good, good. I want this to be easy. I'm sending a corporate jet to pick you up at the private airfield east of Choteo. You know the one I mean. It's only about 2 hours drive from where you are. You'll be there at 5 p.m. tomorrow, and I'll be waiting for you. Take you right down. Can you and Dr. Sattler make that plane? I guess we can. Good. Pack lightly. You don't need passports. I'm looking forward to it. See you tomorrow. Midday sun streamed into the San Francisco law office as Cowan, Swain, and Ross, giving the room a cheerfulness that Donald Gennaro did not feel. He listened on the phone and looked at his boss, Daniel Ross, cold as an undertaker in his dark pinstripe suit. I understand, John, Gennaro said. And Grant agreed to come? Good, good. Yes, that sounds fine to me. My congratulations, John. We can't trust Hammond anymore. He's under too much pressure. The EPA is investigating him. He's behind schedule on his Costa Rican resort, and the investors are getting nervous. There have been too many rumors of problems down there. Too many workmen have died. And now this business about a living Procompsognathus whatever on the mainland. What does that mean? Ross said. Maybe nothing, Gennaro said. But Amachi is one of our principal investors. I got a report last week from Amachi's representative in San Jose, the capital of Costa Rica. According to the report, some new kind of lizard is biting children in the coast. New lizard? Yes, Gennaro said. We can't screw around with this. We got to inspect that island right away. I have asked John Hammond to arrange independent site inspections every week for the next 3 weeks. And what does Hammond say? He insists nothing is wrong on the island. Claims he had all these security precautions. But you don't believe him? Ross said. No, Gennaro said. I don't.
Donald Gennaro had come to Cowan Swain from a background in investment banking. Cowan Swain's high-tech clients frequently needed capitalization, and Gennaro helped them find the money. One of his first assignments back in 1982 had been to accompany John Hammond while the old man, then nearly 70, put together the funding to start the InGen Corporation. They eventually raised almost $1 billion, and Gennaro remembered it as a wild ride.
Hammond's a dreamer, Gennaro said. A potentially dangerous dreamer, Ross said. We should never have gotten involved. What is our financial position? The firm, Gennaro said, owns 5%. General or limited? General. Ross shook his head. We should never have done that. It seems wise at the time, Gennaro said. Hell, it was 8 years ago. We took it in lieu of some fees. And if you remember, Hammond's plans was extremely speculative. He was really pushing the envelope. Nobody really thought he could pull it off. But apparently he has, Ross said. In any case, I agree that inspections is overdue. What about your site experts? I'm starting with expert Hammond already hired a consultant early in the project. Gennaro tossed a list onto Ross's desk. First group is paleontologist, a paleobotanist, and a mathematician. They go down this weekend. I'll go with them. Will they tell you the truth? Ross said. I think so. None of them has much to do with the island. And one of them, the mathematician Ian Malcom, was openly hostile to the project from the start. Insisted it would never work. Could never work. And who else? Just a technical person. The computer system analysis. Review the park's computers and fix some bugs. He should be there by Friday morning. Fine, Ross said. You're making the arrangement? Hammond asked to place the call himself. I think he wants to pretend that he's not in trouble. That it's just a social invitation. Showing off his island. All right, Ross said. But just make sure it happens. Stay on top of it. I want this Costa Rican situation resolved within a week. Grant here. Hi, Dr. Grant. This is Donald Gennaro. I'm the General Consul for InGen. We talked a few years back. I don't know if you remember. I remember. Well, Gennaro said, I just got off the phone with John Hammond, who tells me the good news that you're coming down to our island in Costa Rica. Yes. I guess we're going down there tomorrow. Well, I just want to extend my thanks to you for doing this on short notice. Everybody at InGen appreciated. We have asked Ian Malcom, who like you was one of the early consultants, to come down as well. He's the mathematician at UT in Austin. John Hammond mentioned that. Well, good, Gennaro said. And I'll be coming too, as a matter of fact. By the way, this specimen you have found of a What is it? Procompsognathus. Yes. Do you have the specimen with you, Dr. Grant? The actual specimen? No. I have only seen an X-ray. The specimen is in New York. A woman from Columbia University called me. Well, I wonder if you can bring me the details on that, Gennaro said. Then I can run down that specimen for Mr. Hammond, who's very excited about it. I'm sure you want to see the actual specimen too. Perhaps I can even get it delivered to the island while you're all down here. Grant gave him the information. Well, that's fine, Dr. Grant, Gennaro said. My regards to Dr. Sattler. I look forward to meet you and him tomorrow. This just came. One of the kids brought it back from town. It's from Hammond. Grant noticed the blue and white InGen logo as he tore open the envelope. Inside there were no cover letters, just a bound stack of papers. Pulling it out, he discovered it was blueprints. They were reduced, forming a thick book. The cover was marked Isla Nublar Resort Guest Facility, full set, Safari Lodge. What the hell is this? As he flipped up the book, a sheet of paper fell out. I don't get it, Grant said. These are architectural plans. Grant turned to the plans themselves. They were stamped, "Industrial secrets, do not copy, and confidential work product, not for distribution." Each sheet are numbered, and at the top, these plans represent the confidential creation of InGen Inc. You must have signed document 112-4A, or you risk prosecution. Looks pretty paranoid to me. Maybe there's a reason, Ellie said. The next picture was a topographical map. It showed Isla Nublar as an inverted teardrop, bulging at the north, tarpeting at the south. The island was 8 miles long, and the map divided it into several large sectors. The northern sector was marked Visitor Area, and it contained structure marked Visitor Arrivals, Visitor Center, Administration, Power, Desalinization, Support, Hammond Res, and Safari Lodge. Grant could see the outline of a swimming pool, the rectangular of tennis courts, and the round squeezes that represent planting and shorebearing. Looks like a resort, all right, Ellie said. There followed detailed sheets for the Safari Lodge itself. In the elevation sketches, the log looked dramatic, a long, low building with a series of pyramids shaped on the roof. But there was little about the other buildings in the visitor area, and the rest of the island was even more mysterious. As far as Grant could tell, it was mostly open space, a network of roads, tunnels, and outlying buildings, and a long thin lake that appeared to be man-made, with concrete dams and barriers. But for the most part, the island was divided into big covering areas, with very little development at all. Each area was marked by codes. Is there an explanation for the codes? She said. Grant flipped the papers rapidly, but he couldn't find one. Maybe they took it out, she said. I'm telling you, Grant said, paranoid. He looked at the big curving divisions, separated from one another by the network of roads. There were only 6 divisions on the whole island, and each division was separated from the road by the concrete mound. Outside each mound were a fence with little lightning sign alongside it. That mystified them until they were finally able to figure out it meant the fences were electrified. That's odd, she said. Electrified fence at a resort? Miles of them, Grant said. Electrified fences and mounts together. And usually with a road alongside them as well. Just like a zoo, Ellie said. They went back to the topographical map and looked closely at the counter lines. The road had been placed oddly. The main road ran north-south, right through the central hills of the island, including one sector of the road that seems to be literally cut into the side of the cliff above a river. It began to look as if there had been a deliberate effort to leave these open areas as big enclosures, separated from the roads by mounts and electric fence. And the roads will rise up above ground level, so you can see over the fence. You know, Ellie said, some of these dimensions are enormous. Look at this. This concrete mound is 30 feet wide. That's like a military fortification. So are these buildings, Grant said. He had noticed that each open division had a few buildings, usually located in out-of-the-way corners. But the buildings were all concrete, with thick walls. In side view, elevations, they looked like concrete bunkers with small windows. Like the Nazi pillbox from an old war movies. Back to work, he said. Fire!
Take a look. Think where?
I hate computers, Grant said, squinting in the sun. What happened now? Lost the integrator input, one of the kids said. Just a minute. The kid bent to look at the tangle of wires going into the back of the battery-powered portable computer. They had set the computer up on a beer carton on the top of the hill floor, not far from the device they called Thumper. Grant sat down the side of the hill and looked at his watch. He said to Ellie, "We're going to have to do this the old-fashioned way." One of the kids overheard. "Oh, Alan." "Look," Grant said, "I've got a plane to catch, and I want this fossil protected before I go."
Once you began to expose a fossil, you had to continue, or risk losing it. Visitors imagined the landscape of the Badlands to be unchanging, but in fact, it was continuously eroding, literally right before your eyes. All day long, you could hear the clatter of pebbles rolling down the crumbling hillside, and there was always a risk of a rainstorm. Even a brief shower would wash away a delicate fossil. Thus, Grant's partially exposed skeleton was at risk, and it had to be protected until he returned. Fossil protection ordinarily consisted of a tarp over the site and a trench around the perimeter to control water runoff. The question was how large a trench the Velociraptor fossil required. To decide that, they were using computer-assisted sonic tomography, or CAST, C-A-S-T. This was a new procedure in which Thumper fired a soft lead slug into the ground, setting up shock waves that were read by the computer and assembled into a kind of X-ray image of the hillside. They had been using it all summer with varying results. Thumper was 20 feet away now, a big silver box on wheels with an umbrella on top. It looked like an ice cream vendor's pushcart, parked incongruously on the Badlands. Thumper had 2 youthful attendants loading the next soft lead pellet. So far, the CAST program merely located the extent of finds, helping Grant's team to dig more efficiently, but the kids claimed that within a few years, it would be possible to generate an image so detailed that excavation would be redundant. You could get a perfect image of the bones in 3 dimensions, and it promised a whole new era of archaeology without excavation. But none of that had happened yet, and the equipment that worked flawlessly in the university laboratory proved pitifully delicate and fickle in the field.
"How much longer?" Grant said. "We got it now, Alan. It's not bad." Grant went to look at the computer screen. He saw the complete skeleton, traced in bright yellow. It was indeed a young specimen, the outstanding characteristic of Velociraptor. The single toe claw, which is full-grown animals, was curved, 6-inch-long weapon capable of ripping open its prey. Was in this infant no larger than the thorn of a rush bush. It was hardly visible at all on the screen, and Velociraptor was a lightly built dinosaur in any case, an animal as fine boned as a bird, and presumably as intelligent. Here the skeleton appeared in perfect order, except the head and neck were bent back towards the posterior. Such neck flexion was so common in fossils that some scientists have formulated a theory to explain it, suggested the dinosaurs had become extinct because they had been poisoned by the evolving alkaloids in plants. The twisting neck was thought to signify the death agony of the dinosaurs. Grant had finally put that one to rest by demonstrating that many species of birds and reptiles underwent a postmortem contractions of posterary neck ligaments, which bend the head backward in a characteristic way. It had nothing to do with the cause of death. It had to do the way a carcass dries in the sun. Grant saw this particular skeleton had also been twisted laterally, so that the right leg and foot were raised up above the backbone. "It looks kinda distorted, but I don't think it's the computer." "No," Grant said. "It's just time. Lots and lots of time." Grant knew that people could not imagine geological time. Human life was lived on another scale of time entirely. An apple turned brown in a few minutes. Silverware turned black in a few days. A compass head decayed in a season. A child grew up in a decade. None of these everyday human experiences prepare people to be able to imagine the meaning of 80 million years, the length of time that had passed since this little animal had died. In the classroom, Grant had tried different comparisons. If you imagine the human lifespan of 60 years was compressed to an hour, then 80 million years would still be 3,652 years, older than the pyramids. The Velociraptor had been dead a long time. "Doesn't look very fearsome," one of the kids said. "He wasn't," Grant said. "At least not until he grows up. Probably this baby had scavenged, feeding off carcasses slain by the adults, after the big animals had gorged themselves and lay basking in the sun. Carnivores could eat as much as 55% of their own body weight in a single meal, and it made them sleepy afterwards. The babies would chitter and scramble over the indulgent, summon the bodies of the adults, and nip little bites from the dead animal. The babies were probably cute little animals, but an adult velociraptor was another matter entirely. Pound for pound, a velociraptor was the most rapacious dinosaur that had ever lived. Although relatively small, about 200 pounds, the size of a leopard, velociraptors were quick, intelligent, and vicious, able to attack with sharp jaws, powerful clawed forearms, and the devastating single claw on the foot. Velociraptors hunt in packs, and Grant thought it must have been the sight to see a dozen of these animals racing at full speed, leaping onto the back of the much larger dinosaur, tearing at the neck and slicing at the ribs and belly. "We're running out of time," Ellie said, bringing him back. Grant gave instructions for the trench. From the computer image, they knew the skeleton lay in a relatively confined area. A ditch around the 2-meter square would be sufficient. Meanwhile, Ellie lashed down the tarp that covered the side of the hill. Grant helped her pound in the final stage. "How did the baby die?" one of the kids asked. "I doubt we'll know," Grant replied. "Infant mortality in the wild is high. In African parks, it runs 70% among some carnivores. It could have been anything. Disease, separated from the group, anything. Or even attacked by an adult. We know these animals hunted in packs, but we don't know anything about their social behavior in a group." The students nodded. They had all studied animal behavior, and they knew, for example, that even a new male took over a lion pride, the first thing he did was kill all the cubs. The reason was apparently genetic. A male had evolved to decimate his genes as widely as possible, and by killing the cubs, he brought all the females into heat, so that he could impregnate them. It also prevented the females from wasting their time nurturing the offspring of another male. Perhaps the velociraptor hunting packs were also ruled by a dominant male. They knew so little about dinosaurs, Grant thought. After 150 years of research and excavating all around the world, they still knew almost nothing about what the dinosaurs had really been like. "We've got to go," Ellie said, "if we're going to get to Choteo by 5. "You know, Mr. Gennaro," she said soberly, "when you forget to pack, it makes me think you don't really want to go on this trip." "Maybe you're right," Gennaro said. "I'm missing my kid's birthday." Saturday was Amanda's birthday, and Elizabeth had invited 20 screaming 4-year-olds to share it, as well as Cappy the clown and a magician. His wife hasn't been happy to hear that Gennaro was going out of town. Neither was Amanda. "Well, I did the best I could in short notice," his secretary said. "There's running shoes on your size, and khaki shorts and shirts, and a shaving kit, a pair of jeans, and a sweatshirt if it gets cold. The car is downstairs to take you to the airport. You have to leave now to make the flight." Gennaro walked down the hallway, tearing the sale tags off the suitcase. As he pressed the hall glass comfort room, Dan Ross left the table and came outside. "Have a good trip," Ross said. "But let's be very clear about one thing. I don't know how bad this situation actually is, Darnold, but if there's a problem on that island, burn it to the ground." "Jeez, Dan. You're talking about a big investment. Don't hesitate it. Don't think about it. Just do it. You hear me?" "I hear you. But Hammond, screw Hammond!" My boy. How have you been, my boy?" "Very well, sir," Gennaro replied. He leaned back in the panel leather chair of the Gulfstream Mark II jet as it flew east towards the Rocky Mountains. "You never call me anymore. I have missed you, Donald. How is your lovely wife?" "She's fine. Elizabeth's fine. We have a little girl now." "Wonderful, wonderful. Children are such a delight. She had to get a kick out of our new park in Costa Rica." Gennaro had forgotten how short Hammond was as he sat in the chair. His feet didn't touch the cabinet. He swung his legs as he talked. There was a childlike quality to the man, even though Hammond must have been, 75, 76, something like that. He looked older than Gennaro remembered, but then Gennaro hasn't seen him for almost 5 years.
Hammond was flamboyant, a born showman. And back in 1983, he had an elephant that he carried around with him in a little cage. The elephant was 9 inches high and a foot long and perfectly formed, except his tusks were stunted. Hammond took the elephant with him to fundraising meetings. Gennaro usually carried it into the room, the cage covered with a little blanket like a tea cozy, and Hammond would give his usual speech about the prospects for developing what he called consumer biologicals. Then, at the dramatic moment, Hammond would whip away the blanket to reveal the elephant, and he would ask for money. The elephant was always a rousing success. Its tiny body, hardly bigger than a cat's, promised untold wonders to come from the laboratory of Norman Atherton, the Stanford geneticist who was Hammond's partner in the new venture. But as Hammond talked about the elephant, he left a great deal unsaid. For example, Hammond was starting a genetics company, but the tiny elephant hadn't been made by any genetic procedure. Atherton had simply taken a dwarf elephant embryo and raised it in an artificial womb with hormonal modifications. That in itself was quite an achievement, but nothing like what Hammond hinted had been done. Also, Atherton hadn't been able to duplicate his miniature elephant, and he'd tried. For one thing, everybody who saw the elephant wanted one. Then, too, the elephant was prone to colds, particularly during winter. The sneezes coming through the little trunk filled Hammond with dread. And sometimes the elephant would get his tusks stuck between the bars of the cage and snort irritably as he tried to get free. Sometimes he got infections around the tusk line. Hammond always fretted that his elephant would die before Atherton could grow a replacement. Hammond also concealed from prospective investors the fact that the elephant's behavior had changed substantially in the process of miniaturization. The little creature might look like an elephant, but he acted like a vicious rodent, quick-moving and mean-tempered. Hammond discouraged people from petting the elephant to avoid nipped fingers. And although Hammond spoke confidently of $7 billion in annual revenues by 1993, his project was intensely speculative. Hammond had vision and enthusiasm, but there was no certainty that his plan would work at all, particularly since Norman Atherton, the brains behind the project, had terminal cancer, which was a final point Hammond neglected to mention. Even so, with Gennaro's help, Hammond got his money. Between September of 1983 and November of 1985, John Alfred Hammond and his pachyderm portfolio raised $870 million in venture capital to finance his proposed corporation, International Genetic Technologies Incorporated. And they could have raised more, except Hammond insisted on absolute secrecy, and he offered no return on capital for at least 5 years. That scared a lot of investors off. In the end, they'd had to take mostly Japanese consortia. The Japanese were the only investors who had the patience.
Sitting in the leather chair of the jet, Gennaro thought about how evasive Hammond was. The old man was now ignoring the fact that Gennaro's law firm had forced this trip on him. Instead, Hammond behaved as if they were engaged in a purely social outing. It's too bad you didn't bring your family with you, Darnold. It's my daughter's birthday. 20 kids already scheduled. The cake and the clown. You know how it is. Oh, I understand, Hammond said. Kids set their hearts in things. Anyway, is the park ready for visitors? Gennaro asked. Well, not officially, Hammond said. But the hotel is built, so there is a place to stay. And the animals? Of course, the animals are all there, all in their spaces. I remember in the original proposal you were hoping for a total of 12. Oh, we're far beyond that. We have 238 animals, Darnold. 238? You can't imagine it. We have herds of them. 238. How many species? 15 different species, Darnold. That's incredible, Gennaro said. That's fantastic. And what about all the other things you wanted? The facilities, the computers. All of it. All of it, Hammond said. Everything on that island is state-of-the-art. You'll see for yourself, Darnold. It's perfectly wonderful. That's why this concern is so misplaced. There's absolutely no problem with the island. Then there should be absolutely no problem with an inspection. And there isn't, Hammond said, but it slows things down. Everything has to stop for the official visit. You've had delays anyway. You postponed the opening. Oh, that. It was bound to happen. Bound to happen. Why? Gennaro asked. Well, Darnold, Hammond said, to explain that, you have to go back to the initial concept of the resort. The concept of the most advanced amusement park in the world, combining with the latest electronic and biological technologies. I'm not talking about rides. Everyone has rides. Coney Islands have rides. And these days, everybody has animatronic environments. The haunted house, the pirate den, the Wild West, the earthquake. Everyone has those things. So we set out to make biological attractions, living attractions. Attractions so astonishing, they would capture the imagination of the entire planet. Gennaro had to smile. It was almost the same speech, word for word, that he had used on the investors so many years ago. And we can never forget the ultimate object of the project in Costa Rica. To make money, Hammond said, staring out the window of the jet. Lots and lots of money. I remember, Gennaro said. And the secret to making money in the park, Hammond said, is to limit your personal costs. The food handlers, ticket takers, cleanup crew, repair teams. To make a park that runs with minimum staff. That was why we invested in all the computer technology. We autonomized whatever we could. I remember. But the plain fact is, Hammond said, when you put together all the animals and all the computer systems, you run into a snags. Whoever got a major computer system up and running on schedule? Nobody I know. So you have just had a normal startup delays? Yes, that's right, Hammond said. Normal delays. I heard there were incidents during construction, Gennaro said. Some workmen died. Yes, there were several accidents, Hammond said. And a total of 3 deaths. 2 workers died building the cliff road. 1 other died as a result of an earth-moving accident in January. But we haven't had any accidents for months now. He put his hand on the younger man's arm. Darnold, he said, believe me when I tell you that everything on that island is going forward as planned. Everything on that island is perfectly safe. Seatbelt, please. We're landing in Kyoto. I hate to wait on the money, men, Grant grumbled. Goes with the job. Although many fields of science, such as physics and chemistry, have become fairly funded, paleontologists remain strongly dependent on private patrons. Quite apart from his own curiosity about the island in Costa Rica, Grant understood that. If John Hammond asked for his help, he would give it. That was how patronage worked. How it had always worked. Dr. Grant and Dr. Sattler, Hammond said, it's good of you to join us. Allow me to introduce my associate, Dr. Gennaro. Gennaro was a stocky, muscular man in his mid-30s, wearing an Armani suit and wire-frame glasses. Grant disliked him on sight. He shook hands quickly. When Ellie shook hands, Gennaro said in surprise, You're a woman. These things happen, she said, and Grant thought she doesn't like him either. Hammond turned to Gennaro. You know, of course, what Dr. Grant and Dr. Sattler do. They are paleontologists. They dig up dinosaurs. And then he began to laugh, as if he found the idea very funny. Take your seat, please, the stowdress said, closing the door. Immediately, the plane began to move. You'll have to excuse us, but we're in a bit of a rush. Darnold thinks it's important we get right down there. The pilot announced 4 hours flying time to Dallas, where they will refuel and then go to Costa Rica, arriving the following morning. And how long will be there in Costa Rica? Grant asked. Well, that really depends, Gennaro said. We have a few things to clear up. Take my word for it, Hammond said, turning to Grant. We'll be down there no matter than 48 hours. Grant buckled his seatbelt. This island of yours that we're going to. I haven't heard anything about it before. Is it some kind of secret? In a way, Hammond said. We have been very, very careful about making sure nobody knows about it. Until the day we finally opened that island to a surprised and delighted public. The InGen Corporation of Cupertino, California, had never called an emergency meeting in its board of directors. The 10 directors now sitting in the conference room were irritable and impatient. It was 8 p.m. They had been talking amongst themselves for the last 10 minutes, but slowly had fallen silent, scuffing papers, looking pointable at their watches.
What are we waiting for?
One more, Louis Dodgson said. We need one more. He glanced at his watch. Ron Meyer's office had said he was coming up on 6 o'clock plane from San Diego. He should be here by now, even allowing for traffic from the airport.
You need a quorum?
Yes, Dodgson said, we do. That shut them up for a moment. A quorum meant that they were going to be asked to make an important decision, and God knows they were. Although Dodgson would have preferred not to call a meeting at all, but Stingler, the head of Biosyn, was adamant.
You'll have to get their agreement for this one, Lou.
Depending on who you're talking to, Louis Dodgson was famous as the most aggressive geneticist of his generation, or the most reckless. 34, balding, hawk-faced and intense. He had been dismissed by Johns Hopkins as a graduate student for planning gene therapy on human patients without obtaining the proper FDA protocol. Hired by Biosyn, he had conducted a controversial rabies vaccine test in Chile. Now he was the head of product development at Biosyn, which supposedly consisted of reversing engineering, taking a competitor's product, tearing it apart, learning how it worked, and then making your own version. In practice, it involved industrial espionage, much of it directed towards the InGen Corporation.
In the 1980s, a few genetic engineering companies began to ask, what is the biological equivalent of a Sony Walkman? These companies weren't interested in pharmaceuticals or health. They were interested in entertainment, sports, leisure activities, cosmetics, and pets. The perceived demand for consumer biologicals in the 1990s was high. InGen and Biosyn were both at work in this field. Biosyn had already achieved some success, engineering a new pale trout. This trout was easier to spot in streams and was said to represent a step forward in angling. At least it eliminated complaints to the Fish and Game Department that there were no trout in the streams. The fact that the pale trout sometimes died of sunburn, and that its flesh was soggy and tasteless, was not discussed. Biosyn was still working on that, and,
The door opened and Ron Myers entered the room. Slipped into a seat. Dodgson now has his quorum. He immediately stood. Gentlemen, we're here tonight to consider a target opportunity. InGen. Dodgson quickly reviewed the background. InGen started up in 1983 with Japanese investors. The purchase of 3 Cray XMP supercomputers. The purchase of Isla Nublar in Costa Rica. The stockpiling of amber. The unusual donations to zoos around the world, from New York Zoology Society to the Rampura Wildlife Park in India. Despite all these clues, Dodgson said, we still have no idea where InGen might be going. The company seemed obviously focused on animals, and they had hired researchers with an interest in the past. Paleobiologists, DNA phylogeneticists, and so on. Then, in 1987, InGen bought an obscure company called Millipore Plastic Products in Nashville, Tennessee. This was an agribusiness company that had recently patented a new plastic with the characteristic of avian eggshell. This plastic could be shaped into an egg and used to grow chick embryos. Starting from following year, InGen took the entire output of this Millipore plastic for its own use.
Dr. Dodgson, this is all very interesting.
At the time, Dodgson continued, construction was begun on Isla Nublar. This involved massive earthworks, including a shallow lake 2 miles long in the center of the island. Plans for resource facilities were let out a high degree confidentially, but it appeared that InGen had built a private zoo of large dimensions on the island.
Dr. Dodgson, so what?
It's not an ordinary zoo, Dodgson said. This zoo is unique in the world. It seems that InGen has done something quite extraordinary. They have managed to clone extinct animals from the past.
What animals?
Animals that hatch from eggs and that requires a lot of room in a zoo.
What animals?
Dinosaurs, Dodgson said. They are cloning dinosaurs.
The consternation that followed was entirely misplaced in Dodgson's view. The trouble with money men was that they didn't keep up. They had invested in a field, but they didn't know what was possible. In fact, there had been discussion of cloning dinosaurs in the technical literature as far back as 1982. With each passing year, the manipulation of DNA had grown easier. Genetic material had already been extracted from Egyptian mummies and from the hide of a quagga, a zebra-like African animal that had become extinct in the 1880s. By 1980, it found possible that quagga DNA might be reconstituted and a new animal grown. If so, it would be the first creature brought back from extinction solely by reconstruction of its DNA. If that was possible, what else was also possible? The mastodon? The saber-toothed tiger? The dodo? Or even a dinosaur? Of course, no dinosaur DNA was known to exist anywhere in the world, but by grinding up large quantities of dinosaur bones, it might be possible to extract fragments of DNA. Formerly, it was thought that fossilization eliminated all DNA. Now, that was recognized as untrue. If enough DNA fragments were recovered, it might be possible to clone a living animal. Back in 1982, the technical problems had seemed daunting, but there was no theoretical barrier. It was merely difficult, expensive, and unlikely to work. Yet it was certainly possible, if anyone cared to try. InGen had apparently decided to try.
What they have done is build the greatest simple tourist attraction in the history of the world. As you know, zoos are extremely popular. Last year, more Americans visited zoos than all professional baseball and football games combined. And the Japanese love zoos. And there are 15 zoos in Japan, and more being built. And for this zoo, InGen can change whatever they want. $2,000 a day, $10,000 a day. And then there is the merchandising. The picture books, t-shirts, video games, caps, stuffed toys, comic books, and pets.
Pets?
Of course. If InGen can make a full-size dinosaurs, they can also make pygmy dinosaurs as household pets. What child wouldn't want a little dinosaur as a pet? A little pet animal for their very own. InGen will sell millions of them. And InGen will engineer them so that these pet dinosaurs can only eat InGen pet food.
Jesus.
Exactly, Dachshund said. The zoo is the centerpiece of an enormous enterprise.
You said these dinosaurs will be patented?
Yes. Genetically engineered animals can now be patented. The Supreme Court ruled on that in favor of Harvard in 1987. InGen will own its dinosaurs, and no one else can legally make them.
Well, what prevents us from creating our own dinosaurs?
Nothing, except that they have a 5-year start. It will be almost impossible to catch up before the end of the century. Of course, if we could obtain examples of their dinosaurs, we could reverse engineer them and make them our own. With enough modifications in the DNA to evade their patents.
Can we obtain examples of their dinosaurs?
Dachshund paused. I believe we can, yes. There wouldn't be anything illegal about it. Oh no, Dachshund said quickly. Nothing illegal. I'm talking about a legitimate source of their DNA. A disgruntled employee, or some trash improperly disposed of, something like that.
Do you have a legitimate source, Dr. Dodgson?
I do, Dachshund said. But I'm afraid there are some urgencies to the side, because InGen is experiencing a small crisis, and my sources will have to act within the next 24 hours. A long silence descended over the room. The man looked at the secretary, taking notes, and the tape recorder on the table in front of her. I don't see the need for a formal resolution of this, Dachshund said. Just a sense of the room, as to whether you feel I should proceed. Slowly, the heads nodded. Nobody spoke. Nobody went on record. They just nodded silently. Thank you for coming here, gentlemen, Dachshund said. I'll take it from here.
JetBlue Flight 1116 service to Austin is boarding all customers. All rows at gate 56C.
Louis Dachshund entered the coffee shop in the department building of the San Francisco airport and looked around quickly. His man was already there, waiting at the corner. Dachshund sat down next to him and placed a briefcase on the floor between them. You're late, pal, the man said. He looked at the straw hat Dachshund was wearing and laughed. What is this supposed to be, a disguise? You never know, Docson said, suppressing his anger. For 6 months, Docson had practically convicted this man, who had grown more obnoxious and arrogant with each meeting, but there was nothing Docson could do about that. Both men knew exactly what the stakes were. Bioengineering DNA was, weight for weight, the most valuable material in the world. A single microscopic bacterium, too small to see with the naked eye, but containing the genes for a heart attack enzyme, which prevented frost damage to crops, might worth $5 billion to the right buyer. But InGen presents a tougher challenge. Docson wanted more than bacterial DNA. He wanted frozen embryos, and he knew InGen guarded its embryos with the most elaborate security measures. But to obtain them, he needed an InGen employee who had access to the embryos, who was willing to steal them, and who could defeat the security. Such a person was not easy to find. Docson had finally located a suspectual InGen employee early in the year. Although this particular person had no access to genetic material, Docson kept up the contact, meeting the man monthly at Carlos and Charlie's in Silicon Valley, helping him in small ways. And now that InGen was visiting contractors and advisors to visit the island, it was the moment that Docson had been waiting for, because it meant his man would have access to the embryos. Let's get this down to it, the man said. I've got 10 minutes before my flight. You want to go over it again? Docson said. Hell no, Dr. Docson. I want to see the damn money. That's all of it? That's half of it. $750,000. Okay, fine. The man turned away and drank his coffee. That's fine, Dr. Docson. That's for all 15 species, you remember? I remember. 15 species, frozen embryos. And how am I going to transport them?
Aloha, if you are traveling with Hawaiian Airlines this morning and would like to do the state of Hawaii pre-screening,
That's it?
we ask that you
That's
make
it.
your way over to
They may check my luggage.
for pre-screening.
Just press the top. Not bad. He wiped the phone on the edge of his plate. Not bad. The can's a little heavier than usual is all. Docson's technician team had been assembling it around the clock for the last 2 days. Quickly, he showed him how it worked. How much cooling gas is inside? Enough for 36 hours. The embryos have to be back at San Jose by then. That's up your guy in the boat. Better make sure he brought a portable cooler on board. I'll do that, Docson said. And let's just review the bidding. The deal's the same, Docson said. $50,000 on delivery of each embryo. If they're valuable, an additional $50,000 each. That's fine. Just make sure you have the boat waiting at the east dock of the island, Friday night. Not the north dock, where the big supply boats arrive. The east dock. It's a small utility dock. You got that? I got it, Docson said. When will you be back at San Jose? Probably Sunday. The man pushed away from the counter. You sure you know how to work the... I know, the man said. Believe me, I know. Also, Docson said, we think the island maintains constant radio contact with InGen corporate headquarters in California, so... Look, I got it covered, the man said. Just relax, and get the money ready. I want it all Sunday morning in San Jose Airport, in cash. It'll be waiting for you, Docson said. Don't worry. Shortly before midnight, he stepped on the plane at the Dallas airport. A tall, thin, balding man of 35, dressed entirely in black. Black shirt, black trousers, black socks, black sneakers. Ah, Dr. Malcom, Hammond said, smiling with forced graceness. Hello, John. Yes, I'm afraid your old nemesis is here. Ian Malcom, how do you do? I do math. Certainly Grant recognized his name. Ian Malcom was one of the most famous of the new generation of mathematicians who were openly interested in how the real world works. These scholars broke with the cluster tradition of mathematics in several impossible ways. For one thing, they used computer constantly, a practice traditional mathematicians frowned on. For another, they worked almost exclusively with nonlinear equations in the emergency field called chaos theory. For a third, they appeared to care that their mathematics described something that actually exists in the real world. And finally, as if to empathize their emergence from academy into the world, they dressed and spoke with one senior mathematician called a deplorated excess of personality. In fact, they often behave like rock stars. Malcom sat in one of the pattern tables. The stewardess asked him if he wanted a drink. Diet Coke. Shaken, not sterile. Isn't it a little warm for black? You're extremely pretty, Dr. Sattler. I could look at your legs all day. But no, as a matter of fact, black is an excellent color for heat. If you remember your black body radiation, black is actually best in heat, efficient radiation. In any case, I wear only two colors, black and gray. Ellie was staring at him, her mouth open. These colors are appropriate for any occasions, Malcom continued, and they go well together. Should I mistakenly put on some pair of gray socks with my black trousers? But don't you find it boring to wear only two colors? Not at all. I find it deliberately. I believe my life was vast, and I don't want to waste it thinking about clothing, Malcom said. I don't want to think about what I will wear in the morning. Truly, can you imagine anything more boring than fashion? Professional sports, perhaps. Grown men swatting little balls, while the rest of the world pay money to applause. But on the whole, I find fashion even more tedious than sports. Dr. Malcom, Hammond explained, is a man of strong opinions. And mad as a hatter, Malcom said cheerfully. But you must admit, there are non-trivial issues. We live in a world of frightful givens. It is given that you will behave like this, given that you will care about that. No one thinks about the givings. Isn't it amazing? In the information society, nobody thinks. We expect to banish paper, but we actually banish thought. Hammond turned to Gennaro and raised his hands. You invited him. And a lucky thing, too, Malcom said, because it sounds as if you have serious problems. We have no problem, Hammond said quickly. I always maintained this island would be unworkable, Malcom said. I predicted it from the beginning, and I trust by now we all know what the eventual outcome is going to be. You're going to have to shut the thing down. Shut it down? Hammond stood angrily. This is ridiculous. Malcom shrugged, indifference to Hammond's outburst. I have brought copies of my original papers for you to look at. The original consulting papers I did for InGen. The mathematics are a bit sticky, but I can walk you through it. Are you leaving now? I have some phone calls to make, Hammond said, and went into the adjoining cabinet. Well, it's a long flight, Malcom said to the others. At least my paper will give you something to do. The plane flew through the night. Grant knew that Ian Malcom had his share of detractors, and he could understand why some found his style too abrasive and his applications of chaos theory too glib. Grant thumbed through the papers, glancing at the equations. Your paper conclude that Hammond's island is bound to fail? Correct. Because of chaos theory? Correct. To be more precise, because of the behavioral system is phase-based. Can you explain this in English? Surely. Let's see where we have to start. You know what a nonlinear equation is? No. Strange attractors? No. Alright, Malcom said. Let's go back to the beginning. Physicists had had great success at describing certain kinds of behavior. Planets in orbit, spacecraft going to the moon, pendulums and springs and rolling balls, that sort of thing. The regular movement of objects. These are described by what are called linear equations, and mathematicians can solve those equations easily. We have been doing it for hundreds of years. Okay, Gennaro said. But there's another kind of behavior, which physics handles badly. For example, everything to do with turbulence, water coming out of the spout, air moving over an airplane wing, weather, blood flowing through the heart. Turbulent events are described by nonlinear equations. They are hard to solve. In fact, they are usually impossible to solve. So physicists never understood this whole class of events until about 10 years ago. The new theory that described them is called chaos theory. Chaos theory originally grew out of an attempt to make computer models of weather in the 1960s. Weather is a big complicated system, namely with Earth's atmosphere as it interacts with the land and the sun. The behavior of this big complicated system always defied understanding, so naturally we couldn't predict the weather. But what the early researchers learned from the computer models was that even if you could understand it, you still couldn't predict it. Weather prediction is absolutely impossible. The reason is that the behavior of the system is sensitively dependent on initial conditions. You lost me, Gennaro said. If I use a cannon to fire a shell of a certain weight, at a certain speed, and a certain angle of inclination, and if then fire a second shell with almost the same height, speed, and angle, what will happen? The two shells will land at almost the same spot. Right, Malcom said. That's linear dynamics. Okay. But if I have a weather system that I start up with a certain temperature and a certain wind speed and a certain humidity, and if I then repeat it with almost the same temperature, wind, and humidity, the second system will not behave almost the same. It'll wander off and rapidly will become very different from the first. Thunderstorms instead of sunshine. That's nonlinear dynamics. They are sensitive to initial conditions. Tiny differences become amplified. I think I see, Gennaro said. The shorthand is the butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wing in Peking, and weather in New York is different. So chaos is all just random and unpredictable? Gennaro said. Is that it? No, Malcom said. We actually found hidden regularities within the complex variables of the system's behavior. That's why chaos has now become a very broad theory that's used to study everything from the stock market, to rioting crowds, to brainwaves during epilepsy. Any sort of complex system where there is confusion and unpredictability. We can find an underlying order. Okay? Okay, Gennaro said. But what is this underlying order? It's essentially characterized by the movement of the system within the phase space, Malcom said. Jesus, Gennaro said. All I wanted to know is why you think Hammond's island can't work. I understand, Malcom said. I'll get there. Chaos theory says two things. First, the complex systems like weather have an underlying order. Second, the reverse of that. That simple system can produce complex behavior. For example, pool balls. You hit a pool ball, and it starts to corum off the side of the table. In theory, that's a fairly simple system, almost a Newtonian system, since you can know the force impact of the ball, and the mass of the ball, and you can calculate the angle at which will strike the walls, and you can predict the future behavior of the ball. In theory, you could predict the behavior of the ball far into the future, as it keeps bouncing from side to side. You could predict it will end up 3 hours from now, in theory. Okay, Gennaro nodded. But in fact, Malcom said, it turns out you can't predict more than a few seconds into the future, because almost immediately, very small effects, imperfection in the surface of the ball, tiny indentations in the wood of the table, starts to make a difference. And it doesn't take long before they overpower your careful calculation. So it turns out that this simple system of a pool ball on the table has unpredictable behavior. Okay. And John Hammond's project is another apparently simple system. Animals within a zoo environment that will eventually show unpredictable behavior. You know this because of theory, Malcom said. But hadn't you better see the island to see what he's actually done? No. That is quite unnecessary. The details don't matter. Theory tells me that the island will quickly proceed to behave in an unpredictable fashion. And you're convinced of your theory? Oh yes, Malcom said. Totally convinced. There is a problem with that island. It is an accident waiting to happen. With a whine, the rotors begin to swing in circles overhead, casting the shadows in the runway of San Jose Airport. Grant listened to the crackle on his earphone as the pilot talked to the tower. They had picked up another passenger in San Jose, a man named Dennis Nedry, who had flown in to meet them. He was fat and sloppy, eating a candy bar, and there was sticky chocolates in his fingers, and a flex aluminum foil on his shirt. Nedry had mumbled something about doing computers on the island, and hadn't often to shake hands. From one of the rare seats, Hammond told everyone that it's about a 40-minute trip to arrive at their destination. Through the plexing bubble, Grant watched the airport concrete drop away beneath his feet, and saw the shadow of the helicopter racing along as they went west, towards the mountains. Costa Rica has better population control than other countries in Central America, but even so, the land is badly deforested. Most of this is within the last 10 years. They came down out of the clouds on the other side of the mountains, and Grant saw the beaches of the west coast. They flashed over a small coastal village. Bajanasco, fishing village. Up the coast there, you see the Cabo Blanco Preserve. They have beautiful beaches. The pilot headed straight out over the ocean. The water turned green and then deep aquatic marine. The sun shone on the water. It was about 10 in the morning. Just a few minutes now, and we should be seeing Isla Nublar. Hammond explained that Isla Nublar was not a true island. Rather, it was a seamount, a volcanic upstroting of rocks from the ocean floor. Its volcanic origins can be seen all over the island. There are steam vents in many places, and the ground is often hot underfoot. Because of this, and also because of the prevailing currents, Isla Nublar lies in a foggy area. As we get there, you will see. Ah, there we are. Christ, it looks like Alcatraz. Much larger, of course, 8 miles long and 3 miles wide at the widest point. In total, some 22 square miles, making it the largest private animals preserve in North America. The helicopter began to climb and headed towards to the north end of the island. Grant was trying to see through the dense fog. At the north end of the island, the hills were highest, rising more than 2,000 feet above the ocean. The top of the hills were in the fog, but Grant saw a rugged cliff and crashing oceans below. The helicopter climbed above the hills. Unfortunately, we have to land on the island. I don't like to do this because it'll disturb the animals, and it's something a bit thrilling. Starting our descent now. Hang on, folks. Grant signed it and released his seatbelt. We have to come down fast that way, because the wind sheared. There's often bad wind shears in this peak, and, well, we're safe. Someone was running up to the helicopter, a man with a baseball cap and red hair. He threw open the door and said cheerfully, "Hi, I'm Ed Regis. Welcome to Isla Nublar, everyone. And watch your step, please." A narrow path wound down the hill. The air was chilling and damp. As they moved lower, the mist around them thinned, and Grant could see the landscape better. It looked rather like the Pacific Northwest, the Olympic Peninsula. Down below, they could see the white roof of large buildings, nesting among the planting. Grant was surprised. The construction was elaborate. They moved lower, out of the mist, and now he could see the full extension of the island, stretching away to the south. To the south, rising above the palm trees, Grant saw a single trunk with no leaves at all, just a big curving stump. Then the stump moved and twisted around to face the new arrivals. Grant realized that he was not seeing a tree at all. He was looking at a graceful, curving neck of an enormous creature, rising 50 feet into the air. He was looking at a dinosaur. "My God," Ellie said softly. They were all staring at the animal above the trees. Her first thought that was the dinosaur was extraordinarily beautiful. Books portrayed them as oversized, dumpy creatures, but this long-necked animal had gracefulness, almost dignity, about its movements. And it was quick. There was nothing lumbering or dull in its behavior. The sauropod peered alerted at them, and made a low, trumpeting sound, rather like an elephant. A moment later, a second head rose above the foliage, and then a third, and a fourth. Gennaro was speechless. He had known all along what to expect. He had known about it for years, but he had now somehow never believed it would happen, and now he was shocked into silence. The awesome power of the new genetic technology, which he had formerly considered to be just many words in an overweight sales pitch. The power suddenly became clear to him. These animals were so big. They were enormous, big as a house. And so many of them. Actual damn dinosaurs. Just as real as you could want. "We're going to make a fortune on this place. A fortune," He hoped to God the island was safe. Grant stood on the path on the side of the hill, with the mist on his face, staring at the gray necks craning above the palms. He felt dizzy as if the ground was slumping around too stiffly. He had trouble getting his breath, because he was looking at something that he had never expected to see in his life. Yet he was seeing it. The animals in the mist were perfect apatosaurs, medium-sized sauropods. Grant began to laugh. "What is it?" Hammond said, worried. "Is something wrong?" Grant shook his head and continued to laugh. He couldn't tell them that what's funny was that he had seen the animal for only a few seconds, but he had already begun to accept it, and to use his observation to answer a long, steady question in the field. He was still laughing as he saw a fifth and a sixth neck crane up above the palm trees. The sauropods watched the people arrive. They reminded Grant of an oversized giraffe's. They have the same pleasant, rather stupid gaze. "I take it they're not animatronics," Malcom said. "They're very lifelike." "Yes, they certainly are," Hammond said. "Well, they should be, shouldn't they?" From the distance, they heard the trumpeting sound again. The first animal made it, and then the others joined in. "That's their call," Edregis said, "welcoming us to the island." "You probably want to know what happens next," Hammond was saying, continuing down the path. "We have scheduled a complete tour of the facilities for you and a trip to see the dinosaurs in the park late this afternoon. I'll be joining you for dinner, and we'll answer any remaining questions you may have then. Now, if you'll go with Mr. Regis,"